560 The Answer.
Get the latest weather, traffic, and news updates online at 560theanswer.com. Now, from the Signature Bank Studios. Only the biggest stories, only the biggest guests, and only the biggest opinions. This is AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. Well, sorry, of course I have it. We discussed at length in the first hour. But we turn our attention to the BBB, the big, beautiful bill that was signed into law over the holiday weekend by President Trump. And how are the Dems going to go after it? Seems pretty clear they're going to focus on the alleged cuts in Medicaid coverage, which are not so much cuts in coverage as requirements for the coverage. Requirements for the coverage consistent with the original intention of the program. What a concept. You know, like working if you're an able-bodied adult. Working for the benefit. So you don't incentivize shiftlessness. Again, revolutionary idea. But the reaction you got on the steps of the Capitol from AOC after the bill passed the House last week, the advice and counsel you're getting from Serpent Head down in the Bayou, speak to what I'm saying. First, AOC.
I think this is one of the saddest days in modern American history. This is the largest withdrawal and ending of health care in American history. 17 million people in our country, 17 million Americans in our country are going to lose their Medicaid. They're going to lose their ACA insurance. Small business owners are going to have their health care costs skyrocket. And people are going to have their SNAP and WIC cut back. People are going to go hungry. People are going to get sick. On a scale unlike anything we've ever seen. And all of it is just to finance tax cuts for billionaires and the wealthiest corporations who don't even need it. I don't think we have ever seen or are prepared for how catastrophic this is set to be for a lot of people. And I think it's devastating.
The typical everybody is going to die and they're going to be penniless when they do response to anything that is not open-ended blank check government. And Carville thinks that this is a real political opportunity for the Dems this cycle.
We need to continue to talk about it. This has to be the rallying point of the Democratic Party from now to 2026. We don't need to discuss any divisions in the party. We don't need to discuss anything. We need to have a unified, totally vigorous, totally relentless, never looking back opposition to this.
Right. And what does the actual BBB do when it comes to Medicaid? Well, first of all, this according to CBO, it's 12 million people, according to the CBO estimates, not 17 million, but for AOC to only be off by 40% is pretty impressive for her. The BBB will allegedly, quote unquote, cut Medicaid spending by an estimated $1 trillion over 10 years. 10 years. And the way that it cuts it is not by arbitrarily removing people who are otherwise qualified under the program. And don't forget, they want you to. So actually, I agree with James Carville. Let's continue talking about it so people actually know what they're talking about. That would be nice for a change. Remember, Medicaid was wildly expanded in some states, like those named Illinois and New York and California, by neo-Marxist governors who wanted Medicaid to be a middle-class, middle-income family entitlement program to get more people on the dole, more dependents, more loyal voters. And so other states didn't do that. And so their Medicaid rolls haven't ballooned the way Illinois has, to where nearly 1 in 3 Illinoisans is on Medicaid. Well, the program was never intended to provide coverage for that many people who are otherwise able-bodied and working and making well above poverty level. We've talked about this so many times, but it bears repeating. So Medicaid originally intended to serve indigent children, pregnant women, persons with disabilities. And so you expand it beyond its scope. You never truly fund it because you never account for the the cost of the perverse incentives that you present. And so the people who it's actually intended to serve actually get worse care, get access to less quality care because you're trying to turn it into this entitlement program to buy votes rather than to actually serve those in need that the program was envisioned to serve. $1 trillion over 10 years. And that's against a backdrop of Medicaid spending that is in the hundreds of billions annually. This is, again, a tinkering on the margin when it comes to reducing the cost of these programs. And frankly, the addition of the work requirement that the Senate imposed and the House accepted, despite some grumbling. That is modest. That is not structural reform, the kind of structural reform that these big entitlement programs actually require if they're going to be sustained. For more on the healthcare piece in particular, please be joined by our resident expert on the topic, one of the most knowledgeable people on health insurance in the Western world. C.Steven Tucker is the founder and principal broker of HealthInsuranceMentors.com. He joins us now. CS, thanks for being with us. Appreciate it.
Morning, Dan. Kudos to you for saving me some time in mentioning how Medicaid was massively expanded under the ACA, Obamacare, to people who are able-bodied. In other words, those who can help themselves, and it, of course, disenfranchised those who can't help themselves. And there were waiting lists for care for the people who receive Medicaid traditionally, because, of course, they get a 50% reimbursement ratio from the federal government for those who cannot help themselves or traditional Medicaid recipients, whilst healthy, able-bodied people get a 90% reimbursement rate the state does for their Medicaid expenditures. So there was an incentive, of course, to push the expansion to healthy adults. And I still argue today that that was the most immoral provision of the ACA because it disenfranchised those who can't help themselves. But I digress. The state of Illinois went a step further than doing that. They created 2 new programs for those who are in the United States illegally. The first one, as you are already aware, was shut down last month because they ran out of money. And the cost expenditures were much higher than they were originally predicted to be. But there is still one that is going on now, and that is the program the state of Illinois created called HBIS, Health Benefits for Immigrant Seniors. It was launched in November of 2020 to provide Medicaid benefits to illegal immigrants ages 65 and older who aren't eligible under federal law for Medicare. 10,000 illegal immigrants were enrolled this year in that program, costing Illinois taxpayers and solely us, Illinois taxpayers, about $150 million. And that program continues, even though the prior one failed. But this is where the 1BBB comes in. That's how the one big beautiful bill will be referred to in this conversation going forward. The 1BBB, because Republicans have to sell this. If the state of Illinois does not end that second Medicaid program for illegal immigrants before October 1st of 2027, the 1BBB empowers the federal government to reduce the FMAP, which is the federal reimbursement amount, for the aforementioned 1 billion able-bodied new Medicaid recipients under Obamacare to 80% instead of 90%. That will cost the state of Illinois $800 million annually in federal reimbursements. The government will take the same action against any of the 14 states like Illinois that continue to create and fund Medicaid programs for illegal immigrants using strictly taxpayer dollars. Since there is no FMAP reimbursement for state-created Medicaid programs, the only way to stop states from using their residents' taxpayer dollars to create and fund Medicaid programs for illegal immigrants is to reduce reimbursements for programs that do receive FMAP. So it is a carrot and stick approach. That's what's happening. Either you stop doing these things, or we're going to take away funding from programs that we do have control over.
I think
the first.
Yeah, I not to interrupt, but just a couple of things. One is just the proportionality of this. I just want to get specific. So you're talking about $1 trillion in spending reduction for Medicaid over 10 years, which is sort of fantastical because the idea that this Congress will bind the Congresses of the next decade and the presidents of the next decade is total folly. But even if that occurred, last fiscal year 2023. Medicaid spending by the federal government was $871 billion. It grows at about like 8% compounded annually. And you're talking about that's annually 871. And you're talking about $1 trillion over a decade. And it's, people will die.
Yes. Which brings us to another impact of the one triple B. The reason that the Medicaid rolls have increased so exponentially and the money states receive has increased so exponentially is largely due to provider taxes. There was an interesting piece in the Chicago Tribune yesterday referring to cutting provider taxes as radical, right? And that it's going to cause people to lose their Medicaid coverage, et cetera. Illinois, by the way, through provider taxes, gets about $11 billion a year from the federal government. Here's how it works, okay? States, like Illinois, they collect a tax of up to 6% of revenue from medical providers, medical practitioners. They then return that money to the medical providers as a, quote, additional Medicaid payment. Those additional Medicaid payments draw, of course, larger federal matching funds, which states like Illinois then pay to medical providers through state-directed payments. Then intergovernmental transfers, which are local governments, they send funds to the state, and then those IGTs, intergovernmental transfers, pay those same medical providers much higher Medicaid reimbursement rates. Now, I'm not an attorney, but does that not sound like money laundering?
Yeah, right.
To you?
Yeah, right.
It certainly does.
Moral hazard, I guess would be a much more generous euphemistic term. But that's essentially what it is to grow these programs.
Yes.
It sort of tracks too with what we do with K through 12 education. Maybe something that people have more of a sense of. It's more straightforward. But there's just some interesting research by an economist, Dominic Pino, comparing New York and Florida spending over the last 2 decades, since the beginning of the millennium. New York spending per capita was 30% higher than Florida's in 2000. It was 133% higher last year. Sort of the trajectory of these sort of center-cut blue and red states over the last 2 decades, particularly the last decade when it's accelerated. New York Medicaid spending per capita was 112% higher than Florida in 2000. It was 208% higher last year because what we talked about at the outset, New York expanded Medicaid to middle-income families under Obamacare, and Florida did not. Florida hasn't expanded Obamacare, and New York expanded it more aggressively than any other state. It's sort of the same thing. New York education spending, just to complete the analogy, New York education K through 12 spending is the highest in the country, $35,000. Florida spends $13,000 per student. Florida's fourth graders rank third in the country in reading and fourth in math. New York's fourth graders rank 36th and 46th. So, it's this whole idea that it's if any sort of changing, aligning of incentives, I guess is a better way to say it, any sort of saying this is not what the program was intended to do, this is not what the program is intended to serve, even infinitesimal in the context of overall annual spend, just gets the Chicken Little routine from the left. That's all.
Yeah, and fear-mongering, of course. I would like to remind the author of that Chicago Tribune piece yesterday, who referred to cutting the 6% tax rate on medical providers, which is how this whole scam works, as a backdoor way of cutting federal funding in Illinois under Medicaid. It was President Biden in 2011 who referred to provider taxes as a, quote, scam that should be eliminated. And it was, of course, President Obama who proposed reducing state provider tax percentages from 6% down to 3.5%. That is the exact same percentage mandated in the 1BBB. So it's simply common sense reform, right? Proposed by the way, President Obama. It'll save the federal government $191 billion. But importantly, it forces states like Illinois and California and New York to have more skin in the game, which discourages further wasteful spending. It's just common sense.
So there's that piece on the work requirement at the individual level, but now address the other sort of generic talking point you've been hearing all weekend, as you heard from AOC there. It's going to increase healthcare costs for small businesses. Your response to that?
Yes. How it's going to increase healthcare costs for small businesses is not even addressed in the bill. Neither are Medicare cuts addressed in the bill. All of this fear-mongering, none of it is in the bill. I wish people would read the actual legislation instead of just falling for clickbait. These work requirements, this is nothing new. The same thing has been in place for SNAP, for example, the Nutrition Assistance Program, which we used to call food stamps. It's not that you have to work 80 hours a month. You have to volunteer or attend school. In other words, an upward mobility, doing something that takes you from Medicaid into a more productive member of society. That's what the whole provisions are designed to do. So it's not a radical situation. And it's also, it needs to be noted that anybody who's disabled, pregnant, caring for a child under the age of 14, there are no work requirements. There are no volunteer requirements for those people. They're going to keep the same Medicaid benefits they have now because Medicaid was originally designed to protect them, not able-bodied people who should be working.
And so when you see some Republicans in the Senate and the House, but notably in the Senate, that balked at the Medicaid work requirements, I mean, it basically pushed Tom Tillis into retirement in North Carolina. Josh Hawley, though, in Missouri, too. I mean, hey, Republican or Democrat, I don't care what the label is. If you're saying things that are incorrect, as I think Josh Hawley and Tom Tillis were, then they're incorrect. Am I right?
You are correct, yeah. I mean, there are concerns of how much this funding, this cut in this reimbursement rate is going to affect rural hospitals. So one of the last things that was done after the Senate parliamentarian weighed in is they added another $50 billion to make sure as this transition takes place that those hospitals are protected, to make sure that those who do need Medicaid benefits, again, those who can't help themselves, are protected. So there are all sorts of provisions to ensure that those who Medicaid is designed to originally help are still going to be helped.
Yeah, money laundering for votes. Well, we don't call it money laundering in politics, CS. We call it horse trading. That sounds so much more pleasant, doesn't it?
Exactly.
C.Steven Tucker, founder and principal broker, healthinsurancementors.com, healthinsurancementors.com. CS Tucker, CS, thank you as always. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Dan.
And he joined us on the Turnkey.Pro answer line.
It's what Chicago is talking about. It's Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan and Amy on AM 560. The Answer.
Wow. At the time of this being written, both gold and silver are up some 40%. That's 40% in just 1 year. In fact, this past year, gold has broken all-time historic records by hundreds of dollars an ounce. And unlike all other financial